Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you all. Welcome to Rational Religion, where we make sense of spirituality. This is an installment in our interview series called In Dialogue, where we bring you fresh perspectives on science and wider society. Today, very happy to have Brother Qasim Rashid on the show with us. He's a sort of a spiritual activist, if you will, in the United States of America. Has written 3 fantastic books, is a best-selling Amazon.com author, and tours widely dispelling misconceptions about Islam. Thanks for coming on the show, Qasim Bhai.
Thanks for having me, Omar Bhai. Great to be here.
Awesome. So we're hearing, especially here in the UK, a lot about what's happening in America with the Muslim ban, as it's called, and it seems like Trump came in on a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment. So, what's it like to be a Muslim in the in what I may provocatively call Trump's America at the moment?
I don't think he necessarily came in on anti-Muslim sentiment. I think he fanned the flames that were, relatively minor compared to maybe right after 9/11 even, and he kind of rode a wave that he created himself. As Ahmadiyya Muslims, we look at this from a much different lens than most of, let's just call the orthodoxy. And that's for 2 reasons, I think. I think the most obvious reason is because we have khilafat, and the blessing of having a khalifa is simply that I have this theory called worry transfer, that a khalifa effectively takes your worry away and teaches you how to rely on Allah, and most certainly, as the hadith says, tie your camel. And so we're taking precautions and being cautious of what we're doing and how we're doing it, and I can delve into that. But as far as the mind frame, I don't see the same worry among Ahmadiyya Muslims that I'm seeing among the orthodoxy, and I think that just comes back to the blessing of Khilafat. I think the second reason why things are a little bit different from our vantage point is very practically, quite frankly, we've already been through this once. And there's nothing that is being proposed to do to Muslims in America that isn't already being done to Ahmadi Muslims in Pakistan, Indonesia, Bangladesh, several Arab states, many Muslim majority nations. And, one of my favorite quotes of the Promised Messiah Islam is that persecution of a divine community is like manure for plants. It's fertilizer. And so, one thing that we've seen here in the United States is that every time the president makes some anti-Muslim or anti-Islam comment, we get a surge of people going to trueislam.com, hitting us up on social media, asking us to come to the masjid, wanting to get a copy of the Quran. My Time op-ed that I wrote a few weeks ago, I thanked him. I thanked Mr. Trump, not because I agree with anything that he's doing, but because every time he tweets about us to his 25 million followers, more people want to learn about Islam. And so in that way, he's kind of become like the Da'ilallah that we all
the caller unto Allah.
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of the way I look at it right now. That's not to say that there aren't serious issues that need to be addressed, but I'm inherently an optimist, and I'm looking at this from an optimistic standpoint. That I think that hatred and bigotry does not win. It won't win. It can't win. And that love and compassion will win out, no doubt.
Yeah. You mentioned a few things there: Promised Messiah, Khilafat or Caliphate, and the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. Could you just briefly say a few words on what those words mean, what those concepts are?
Yeah. So one of the overriding themes of many religions is that in the latter days, this reformer, this Messiah figure will come. And I was carpooling with a few strangers actually the other day. And 2 were Catholics and 1 was Jewish, and they were arguing about religion. And at the end, they said, "Well, at least we agree that this Messiah is going to come and save humanity." And I just kind of chuckled about that, right? Because if there's a certain way to start a religious war, it's by God sending 20 different messiahs and saying, "I am that Messiah." So, as Ahmadi Muslims, we're Muslims who believe in the Messiah, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian. We believe he is that awaited reformer, that Messiah, that latter-day prophet that would come to revive Islam and reform Muslims. And people ask that, well, if he's come and gone already, and there's still all this war and terror happening, then did he really do anything? And the answer to that is quite simply, he did everything he was supposed to do, he was commissioned to do, and that is by establishing a divine community that is dedicated to the worship of one God and the service of all humanity, and by establishing, or I should say reestablishing, true Islamic caliphate, a spiritual caliphate that is based off of righteousness, that is based off of justice, tempered with mercy, as opposed to this dictator terrorist in Iraq and Syria. And the evidence that this caliphate is successful is because since this caliphate was established in 1908, you have seen how many hundreds of regimes rise and fall, secular governments rise and fall and collapse into oblivion. But this caliphate continues to spread peacefully. Now is in 209 nations worldwide, leading tens of millions of Muslims, all without a single act of terrorism, all without a single act of brutality, all without a single act of oppression. This is the leadership that the Muslim world needs and that the world at large needs. And again, and I'll close with this small point about it. This is not a dogmatic argument. I'm not asking you to make any belief on blind faith. I'm telling you, look at this proven model of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community under true Islamic caliphate. That proven model should be all the evidence you need. Was that Mark Twain who said that nothing is quite as annoying as a good example? Because what are you going to say? It's a good example. You can't argue with something that's proven. And so that's my, if you want to call it a pitch, that's my pitch to people who are wondering whether there's any validity to this Messiah, to this Caliph. Come and observe the behavior yourself, and I think you'll see for yourself how this is not just theory, but this is practically uniting humanity with peace and understanding.
Okay. How has the rest of the Muslim world sort of responded to that? And I understand your first book was largely on that subject from a personal point of view.
Well, it's interesting because you see a significant number of people who are members of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community who come from Sunni and Shia backgrounds. You know, I mean, my grandfather was a Sunni. He became agnostic for a while and then came back to Islam and then eventually joined the Ahmadiyya Muslim community only in 1947.
Yeah.
You know, so that's literally yesterday's newspaper. I mean, there are millions of black Ahmadis in America. I'm sorry, millions of black Ahmadis in America and Africa who have had Ahmadiyya in their family much longer than mine. People think that I'm Pakistani, therefore by default. So we're seeing, you know, this surge of Sunni and Shia Muslims uniting under the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, and we're starting to see more Muslim leaders come out and say, maybe I don't agree with you theologically, but I recognize that you're not only Muslim, but you're doing some phenomenal work. When the Khalifa recently spoke in Canada just a few weeks ago, or a few months ago now, there are some well-known quoted Muslim Sunni imams who acknowledge that this man is speaking absolute truth, and this is the message that humanity needs going forward. So while unfortunately from some state governments there's some vehement and vicious persecution of Ahmadi Muslims, and there's no denying that, I think that by looking at the people, and that's what really matters, looking at the masses of the people, when they're presented with this example of Khilafat, of Ahmadiyyat, of Muslims who believe in the Messiah, it's very difficult for them to turn a blind eye to it, because again, it's very difficult to argue with a proven model.
I guess it's the ultimate response to, you know, Islam is what Islam does, and we look in the Middle East and you've got these dictatorships and stuff. You're saying this is an actual model of true Islamic teachings, completely peaceful, never had any kind of instance of terrorism. So I guess that's the ultimate answer to that.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, when people say, well, you know, the clerics, the ulama have declared you non-Muslim, I'll say, okay, let's take that for a second, right? Let's assume that that has validity to it. By that same logic, the fact that what's happening in Syria is the fault of the clerics as well. What's happening in Rohingya is the fault of the clerics as well. What's happening in Gaza is the fault of the clerics as well. You can't just cherry pick one part of what the clerics have done and say, oh, the rest of that's not their fault. No, you embrace all of it. If you're going to cite them on something so vicious and violent as takfir, to declare somebody a non-Muslim, well, then you better embrace the whole package, because cherry picking is not an option at this point. You either accept everything they do or none of what they do. You being exclusionary and cherry picking only what you think you like or what you think you don't like, it ignores from the fact that their takfir is what leads to terrorism. And their intolerance is what leads to terrorism. So you can't, on one hand, say, I accept their intolerance, but I don't accept the resulting terrorism from it. That's like saying, I pulled the trigger, but what happened with the bullet? Not my fault. It's stupidity. It's complete stupidity.
Yeah. Just kind of going on from that. So what if someone were to say, okay, Qasim, right? We get the Ahmadiyya Muslim community is peaceful. It's very nice. It's spread over across the world. It's got nice leadership. But who's to say that your interpretation of Islam is any more valid than the interpretation of Islam of extremists and terrorists? What if religion is just the kind of thing where if you're nice people, then you'll have a nice interpretation. If you're not nice people, then you have a bad interpretation.
So I think there's a couple of ways to answer that. So one, I just got asked this yesterday on Twitter by a young Muslim woman who identifies as Salafi. And she said, well, why is Ahmadiyya correct and Salafi wrong?
Yeah.
And I said, well, it's difficult to get into a too lengthy of an argument on Twitter, but fundamentally, here's the premise. Truth doesn't need censorship. Truth doesn't need force behind it. It doesn't need a sword behind it. Truth can manifest itself through argument and through rationale. Look at those governments that are promoting Salafi ideology. They're also promoting censorship, death for blasphemy laws, death for apostasy laws. They know that their death blow comes from scrutiny and from observation. And again, there's another one of my favorite quotes of the Promised Messiah, ﷺ, where he says that that religion which needs the sword to establish itself slays its own throat before reaching others. It needs no other argument for its falsification. So when you compare that with what the Ahmadiyya Muslim community is doing, we're not the ones censoring. We're the ones being censored. Yeah. We're not the one killing people for leaving Islam. We're being killed because we're being accused of having left Islam, which is simply not true. So, again, it goes back to the proven model. If you think you have truth, well, prove it. Show it to me. I want to know. This is what the Quran commands us to reflect, to investigate, to ponder, to contemplate. But you're not letting me do any of that stuff. You're just telling me that I'm going to go to jail for saying Assalamu alaikum, which is literally the law in Pakistan for Ahmadiyya Muslims.
Yeah.
Second part of that is, on the broader religion thing, often asked by atheists, somebody's asked that today as well to me, that, well, why do we even need religion? Why can't we just be good people?
Yeah.
Well, let's look at that, right? Let's first take a very simple question. Let's define good. What is good? Because good in one scenario can be evil in another scenario. If I'm giving somebody food, you would say, oh, that's good. But then if I give you the context that I'm giving a wealthy man food while a poor man is starving, that wouldn't be considered good at all. That'd be considered immoral. So we have to first identify what is being a good person. Because if you ask someone like President Trump, he says that these raids that he's conducting, that's ripping families apart, that's good. Yeah, it's keeping us safe. That's what he genuinely thinks it's good.
Yeah.
But when you ask the families who are being torn apart and destroyed for having done no wrong whatsoever, it's anything but good. So before we can get into this whole conversation of why we even need a religion, first I want someone to even simply define for me this very simple question, what is good? Give me that very simple objective definition. And if you can't, if it's simply your own arbitrary opinion, which it is, because every person, an atheist, has their own arbitrary opinion, then don't talk to me about why we need religion. Because if you can't even define this very basic question, how are you going to define how human interaction should work on a local, national, and international scale?
Okay, so let's say I was, God forbid, an anti-Islam troll on Twitter, right? So next thing I'd say is, you're saying you have some sense of good. Well, is good punishing people for apostasy? Is it imposing Sharia law on people? I mean, are these things that Islam teaches?
So then I would say to that person, you're conflating two different things. You're not defining good, first of all. And second of all, you're imputing things to Islam based on what extremists teach, not based on what the Quran and the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, teach. Yesterday I had this anti-theist trolls, these people who aren't just I have no problem with atheists. I think, as far as I'm concerned, an atheist is somebody who hasn't seen evidence of God to whatever their understanding is, and I want to create a world where they have complete freedom of conscience to believe or not believe, and research or not research. That's their right, and I have no problem with that. The anti-theists, the people who want to actively destroy religion, who actively want to censor and oppress, these are the people that I have a problem with. And so I had this anti-theist troll come after me with that exact claim. And when I presented actual scholarships, the response was Wikipedia articles and highly offensive memes. And so for me, what that tells me is that you're not actually interested in dialogue. You're interested in Wikipedia, which you can do, but that's not going to get you a very good answer. Until we can have evidence-based scholarship and dialogue, not Google scholarship, not Wikipedia, we're not going to get very far. But the problem is that these people who launch some of these allegations aren't really willing to have that detailed understanding and explanation in the long term.
How can you tackle that as someone who sort of does this day in, day out? How do you get through that layer of I guess prejudice to an extent, but I think also fear of the unknown, fear that these people are threatening our culture? How can you do that? It seems like a tough ask.
I think it goes back to, there's a great book written by the fourth Khalifa of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Community, Hazrat Mirza Tahir Ahmad, An Elementary Study of Islam.
Yeah.
And in here, in the chapter on the unity of God, he points out something that's so simple, but I just found so profound, that every person is motivated by hope and fear. These are the two things that motivate every person, hope and fear. Those who believe in God are motivated by hope in getting nearness to God and fear of displeasing God. Those who don't believe in God are motivated by hope of worldly gain and fear of worldly loss. And so as I thought about this, I realized that every person that comes at me, and by I mean come at me, I mean whether they're sending me a death threat or whether they're sending me a note that says I signed up as a Muslim ally at trueislam.com, every person is coming at me for the same reason, and that is that they want peace. So whether somebody, and I got a death threat today, somebody sent me a death threat today that Muslims are cockroaches, you better hope I don't meet you in the street, right? And at the same time, I got people telling me, you're my brother, I'm your sister, we're in this together. What's motivating both of them is the desire to have inner peace. The one who's trying to kill me thinks that his inner peace will come by eliminating me as what he perceives as a threat. And the one who's sending me messages of love and compassion believes that by creating a bond of brotherhood and sisterhood, we can be stronger together and therefore we can have peace. So for me, the first step was understanding this very basic concept that people are not evil. People are not, you know how, in fact, your brother gave a great lecture about this, that, people like Darth Vader, right, these fictional villains, they don't actually exist in real life, right? The Sith Lord doesn't act, because nobody says, I'm evil, come my way, right? Everybody sees what they're doing as good. And this is what the Quran says, that we have made their ways appear to them as good. So when this person is coming at me as a death threat, he still thinks he's doing something good, which goes back to our earlier point, define good, right? He still thinks he's doing something good because he's trying to find peace. And so I think recognizing that, I respond in a way that hopefully de-escalates the situation.
Yeah.
And while it's impractical and probably naive to think that you can convince every person to have a civilized dialogue, in the past, I've seen, and I've experienced multiple occasions where somebody came at me very aggressively, very angrily, and because they were willing to simply have at least enough dialogue to see that I wanted the same thing as them, and that's peace, we were able to walk away, not necessarily agreeing on religion, because for me that's not important, but agreeing that we need to work together against ignorance and hate and fear. So there's no easy way to do it, but I think if we focus our attention and recognize that our greater purpose here is to serve humanity for the sake of God, then we have a much higher chance of success in neutralizing people who are trying to divide us.
Yeah. Okay. That goes a long way to answering what is also going to ask, which is, how do we not demonize people who voted for a certain candidate as if they're all one thing and they're all terrible people, because I think that's a narrative which is out there, which is really counterproductive and completely not true. And you're saying recognize their humanity and just do your best to extend their hand, and if they don't give you their hand, then go on your way.
And there's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there, and what I mean by that is there's a lot of people out there who genuinely want to have the opportunity to understand. They just genuinely do, and I think it would be a disservice to simply just dismiss them and say that that they're not worth anyone's time. I mean, we had a Trump surrogate who at one of our masjids in Pennsylvania, or near one of our masjids in Pennsylvania, say some really nasty things about Islam,
Right.
and all the Muslim groups were furious and upset, and we did something people thought was a little bit counterintuitive. We invited him to our masjid,
Yeah.
and he came and he broke bread with us, and he left saying that I still am a devout Christian, but I don't have that same fear of Islam that I did when I walked through these doors a couple hours ago. And he's since become a friend. So that's, I think, the message that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, established. That's how he won the hearts. That's how he spread Islam. And I think it's incumbent upon us to utilize that same tactic in the 21st century.
I was a bit confused when you said Trump surrogate. I was like, a Trump impressionist? Did Alec Baldwin come down?
You see that paper in Honduras, I think, or Dominican?
Yeah.
That used Alec Baldwin instead of Trump. That was great.
I prefer him, by far and away. Okay, cool. What is the... I can imagine a lot of Americans out there who maybe haven't met a Muslim, because, there's an absurd, I can't remember the statistic, there's this absurd number of people in America who haven't ever met a Muslim.
62%.
That is stunning. That is absolutely shocking. And that goes a long way to explaining what's going on, right?
Yeah.
A lot of them, I imagine, will also feel like Muslims are this foreign force, these invaders that have come in very recently, and now they're changing things, they're threatening us, post 9/11 especially. I mean, what would you say to that? I mean, how deeply woven is Islam in the American fabric?
Well, I think if people really knew the history of Islam in America, they'd be shocked. Even before Columbus, there's ample evidence that Muslims were in what's now the United States. Ibn Ben Sertima is an African historian that talks about how African Muslims arrived here as early as 899.
Wow.
I mean, that's shocking. That's within only a couple of centuries of the passing of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that they had arrived here.
Yeah.
And there's towns named Muhammad in America that predate the resurgence of Muslims in America in the early 20th century. After African Muslims came here as explorers, and by the way, you'll notice that they didn't rape, pillage, and savage the Native Americans. They
we keep that under wraps.
they integrated with them, they intermarried with them, and they established communities here. But then the transatlantic slave trade, the European slave trade, also brought up to 30% of those who were enslaved and brought here were African Muslims, up to 30%, which is a remarkable figure to consider when you figure that there were up to 20 million people who were captured in the slave trade, of whom about 600,000 survived and made it here. I mean, about 10 million died through the Middle Passage. The other 10 million were spread throughout the Americas. And about 500,000, 600,000 arrived in the United States, and up to 30% of those were African Muslims. And so when we talk about who built this country, whose free labor built this country, it was Muslims. Played a significant part in that. A massively important part of that were Muslims. And realizing that Muslims were prone to revolt against these slave masters, they then tried to indoctrinate these Muslims with Christianity, by forcing them into adulterous relationships. They would break up. If they determined that people were married, they would break them up and make them commit adultery with each other. They would take children away, so they would lose their identity. The most horrific things you can imagine were done by these so-called Christian slave masters. I say so-called because I think you'll agree with me, nothing about Christianity or Christ teaches this barbarity. And so the most horrific conditions were placed upon these Muslims, and most certainly among these Christian Africans, for a period of several hundred years. And that legacy, I think, lives through. I think that legacy is why when Hazrat Mufti Muhammad Sadiq, who was a companion of the Promised Messiah, when he arrived on the shores of Philadelphia in 1920, and in 3 years he brought over 700 Americans into Islam, I think in part that had to do with the fact that the legacy of Islam in America was, it may have been buried, but it was still there. And it's still there now. And I foresee that in the future, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10 years, maybe in 50 years, that Americans will see Islam as a religion that truly unites humanity with peace, with understanding, without compulsion, without force, without terrorism, and that it's a religion that reunites people with their creator. We can blame the media, and I think it's very easy to do. I think it's also very lazy to do. I think it's our job to write the narrative of Islam, and if we don't write it, other people will write it for us. So this opinion may not be very popular among many Muslims, but it might be. But I think that Muslims are just as responsible for the negative image of Islam in the media right now. We haven't done our job effectively of reaching out. When we look at the example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, I mean, he went from caravan to caravan. He went from literally tent to tent to announce his arrival. He took stones to the mouth, took stones to the head. He took beatings, camel entrails, garbage thrown on him, every conceivable thing imaginable to announce that he was God's prophet and that Islam was a religion that God had chosen for humanity. I can probably count on one hand how many Muslims have done that within the Ahmadiyya Muslim community as well, at least as I know in America. Yeah. And the people that can count on one hand are people like the late Yusuf Latif, an Ahmadiyya Muslim who died. He's an African American Ahmadiyya Muslim who died in 2013. Our beloved Uncle Abid Hanif, who accepted Ahmadiyyat in the 1940s, and he's by the grace of Allah about 90 years old now. And he showed me the scars on his head that he got from police brutality just from preaching Islam in America. We talk about police brutality now. He was joking with me several years ago that he was getting beat up by police before it was cool to get beat up by police. I mean, he's a lovely human being. He's a scholar of Arabic. He taught himself Arabic, and he's just a remarkable person. And so when people ask me about the legacy of Islam in America, I could talk forever, because it is such a powerful legacy, and it's such a shame that we've done an ineffective job of conveying that effectively.
So what is the American chapter at the moment of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community doing to try and remedy that and to try and get our message out there in the public eye?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of different things. We have the True Islam campaign at trueislam.com, where we're asking people to sign on as a Muslim ally, read these 11 points that kind of define where Islam stands on some really hot topics, as opposed to where extremists teach. And this is a project that our men's auxiliary and women's auxiliary is working together on. Our Khudam al-Ahmadiyya, or our Muslim youth, male youth association, is working on the Meet a Muslim campaign, where they're literally going into the streets with signs saying "Meet a Muslim" and come have conversations.
62% to go.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and so we're inviting people to the masjid. We're having these coffee, cake, and true Islam sessions where we're getting together at a local coffee shop and just having a conversation on Islam and offering coffee and cake to lure them in. And then we pounce on the Sharia. Right? And it's been really powerful. I mean, we've had people who were vehemently anti-Muslim come in on a whim, or come in against what they thought was their better judgment, and leave as dear friends, leave as strong allies. So again, a lot more we can do, but we're doing it. We're building it.
Just to bring things to a close, can you tell us a little bit about any kind of personal experiences you've had where you've met someone who was very much against Islam and against meeting Muslims, and how that sort of changed? Are there any examples that sort of stick in your mind?
There's a lot. I mean, one that I like to share a lot because it's such a relevant example was I spoke at a church in Ohio a few years ago, and the church had initially canceled my attendance because the congregation just basically revolted, said, no, we don't want a Muslim in our church. We just don't want him here. Yeah. And so the pastor, who had invited me, very regrettably said, it's canceled. I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do. But he continued to try, and he got one of his colleagues, a fellow pastor at a different church, to invite me and to have me come speak to his congregation. So the first church canceled, the second church I spoke at, and the tension was tangible. I mean, you could feel it.
Yeah.
Went through our lecture, dialogue, Q&A. Afterwards, a young man who couldn't have been more than 30 came up to me, and maybe he was 35. I mean, he said he was 18 when 9/11 happened. So, and this happened in 2013. So just do the math. He was about 30, 35.
Yeah.
He pulled me aside. He said, "Look, I want you to know that I didn't want to come here today, and I only came here because my pastor said that I should come, and I trust him, but I still didn't want to come here today." And the reason why I didn't want to come here is because I hate Muslims and I want to kill Muslims. I joined the military because I wanted to kill as many Muslims as I possibly could. And having sat here and listened to you today, and your brother, my brother's a United States Marine veteran, I realized that I hated something or hated someone that I didn't know, that I didn't understand. And if this is what Islam is, then I feel embarrassed for having so much hatred in my heart for all these years. And I have a lot of examples like that. But I think that it shows us two things, right? One, it shows us the critical importance of in-person dialogue.
Yeah.
And I think the second thing that it shows us is the critical importance of religious leaders, the pastors and the ministers, and the imams and the clerics taking the lead for that dialogue, because they're effectively the gatekeepers. There's a reason why the Quran repeatedly states that the ringleaders of those who are creating fitna, those who are creating chaos and disorder, that the ringleaders will have a double punishment. And that double punishment isn't just because it's arbitrary. It's because they were the megaphones of the intolerance that misled their followers. And the followers aren't left off the hook because every person still has free choice, but their punishment is still less than the ringleaders. But likewise, leaders also get a double reward as well, because they took what essentially wasn't the popular opinion. And this pastor, Pastor Leo Cunningham, I love him to death. He didn't have to even reach out to me in the first place, and he certainly didn't have to continue to try to make something work when clearly his entire congregation was opposing him. But because he did, it made such a massive difference to so many of his Christian congregants and in his life, and of course in my life. But that's the power of dialogue, and that's why it's so much more important for us to get out into the streets and meet with our fellow Americans, to have those face-to-face conversations.
And in doing so, I guess you create a million little ripples, which, God willing, turn into something much more powerful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's say someone's out there is watching this, doesn't know too much about Islam generally, but kind of likes the message which you're giving, and is in America. What should they do to find out a bit more and to get in contact with you guys and maybe meet you guys in person?
Yeah, go to trueislam.com, click on the events tab, put in your zip code, and it'll let you know of all the coffee cake and True Islam meetups that are near you, and come meet us. We thought about doing these at the mosque, but we wanted to remove any hesitancy and have it at a neutral ground, where people can feel comfortable. It's in a public setting. We really want to just strip away any concern people might have, whether it's something as minor as I don't know what to wear to the mosque, versus I don't know what's going to happen to me once I go inside the mosque, right? We wanted people to know that there's no such thing as a dumb question. There's no such thing as a dumb concern. Come meet us at your local Starbucks, your local Dunkin' Donuts, your local Panera, what have you, and let's have a conversation together. So that's what I would ask people to do. Come check us out. Bring your kids. We bring our kids as well. Let our kids play together. And see firsthand how beautiful life is when your kids can start to play together despite our differences.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Brother Qasim, for coming on the show. Hopefully we can have more dialogue as time goes on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for doing this, and thanks for having me as well.